See. Good morning, Giovanni. Everybody's starting to join us. So it looks like we got a couple people in. I guess we'll go ahead and begin with the presentation. So today we're going to talk about language revitalization and materials development, which is something that's very interesting to me and my area of focus. My name is Danielle Yarbrough, and I'm a PhD student here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I am in my 4th year, so quite far along. I have been working with language revitalization with primarily 2 different groups, the Amskapi Pikani, or the Blackfeet Nation, in what's now known as northwestern Montana. And currently, I also work here with the Kanaka Maoli, the Hawaiian population here in Hawaii. So I'm very interested in language revitalization. I started out with documentation and kind of geared myself more towards how to use linguistics to help in the community goals of revitalization. And that led me to materials development as well. I work with a company called Native Teaching Aids that creates teaching materials for Indigenous languages and particularly games. So I'm very interested in that. Today, we will be talking kind of a broad overview of language revitalization, what it is, as far as like definitions, what are some popular routes people take in language revitalization, and then we'll talk about materials development, kind of a starting point, just to spark some inspiration in how to create materials for language revitalization, and then we'll primarily spend most of our time looking at examples of what other communities have already started to do. Both of these topics, language revitalization and materials development, can be full courses on their own. So it is going to be kind of a very general overview of both of these topics, but they'll give you some good starting points if you're not already familiar with them, and hopefully spark some inspiration for some materials for you to create for your own communities. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. First thing I like to do is start off with asking what language is, right? I think there are different viewpoints on what language is, how do we define language, and some of the more common answers that come up when asking different groups of people. So go ahead and in the comments section, write down what your definition of language is, and then we'll move on. So I'll give you a few seconds here to go ahead and start writing that. I know there's a lag. All right, so some of the answers are going to vary, obviously, if you're asking a linguist versus if you're asking a community member. And I was lucky enough to be a part of the Expanding Linguistic Science by Broadening Native American Participation workshop that was held at the Linguistic Society of America's annual meeting in 2018. And it was a workshop that brought together linguists and community members from various different communities in Native North America. And when this question was asked, these were some of the answers that came up during that presentation. So you have things like arts are living perspective, identity, it brings healing and empowerment, it's a part of who we are. And these are common ways of defining language and conceptualizing language within a community where non-Indigenous linguists tend to think of it as a system of rules. Many of the things you've talked about during this webinar, phonology, morphology, syntax, things that are able to be studied and broken down and approached in a more scientific manner. And so I think with language revitalization, it's interesting to see how we can blend these two aspects. So the more scientific approach of actually breaking apart language and understanding it from a very mechanical sort of viewpoint, and then making sure to incorporate and really uphold the Indigenous viewpoints on what language is. So now that we know what language is, let's talk about language revitalization. And this is an older definition by Miller, that language revitalization is the attempt by interested parties, including individuals, cultures, or community groups, governments, or political authorities, to reverse the decline of a language. If the decline is severe, the language may be endangered, moribund, or extinct. In these cases the goal of language revitalization is to often recover the spoken use of the language. Like I said, this is an older definition. Some of this language may be problematic depending on where you are in the community. I tend to avoid terms like moribund, especially terms like extinct. But this is basically a point where language is shifting away from being spoken as the daily means of communication and is now either not being spoken at all or spoken in very limited contexts and domains. Language revitalization is a very broad term and kind of the go-to term, but it's called language revital, language reclamation, reversing language shift, and language awakening. These can all be variations of it. They all have slightly different connotations, but for the purposes of this workshop, we're going to stay with language revitalization. All right, so, excuse me. So some general facts about languages and language endangerment revitalization is languages can be lost fairly quickly. The number of speakers can dwindle more than expected. It only really takes 3 generations. The first generation being the one who stops using the language to speak to their children. So that's where we see that initial break in intergenerational transmission. And this can happen for so many reasons. As you can see in the second bullet point, there's a multitude of factors that can contribute to language revitalization, from political aspects like colonization or overt oppression of the language, to more social and economic factors like stigmatization, belief of economic disadvantages that come along with Indigenous languages, or just simply globalization and a movement away from the more local communities into a global viewpoint. So there's many different factors. They all have different impacts on the community. So recommended that if you aren't part of the community and you're coming from outside of that, that you really get to know those factors in the history of the group that you're working with, because it does impact not only how the language came to be endangered, but conditions aspects of the revitalization. It's an ongoing effect. These things don't happen in the past and stay there. So once that first generation really has stopped speaking to their children, the second generation develops what we call passive knowledge. So they are able to understand the language, but aren't so great at articulating the language themselves. So they're kind of this mid-ground where they have some knowledge, but they're not fluent speakers anymore. And by the third generations, when they have their children, that generation has close to little knowledge of the language. They may have some exposure from their grandparents, but for the most part, they have been disconnected from that language. So what we want to do is think about those situations when looking at the context that language revitalization is happening in, and think of those and evaluate those when you embark on language revitalization. Because like I said, they continue on and they impact the situation, not only from the past, but throughout the language revitalization process, they will be a factor. Another thing to keep in mind is languages change, and that is a natural part of any healthy language. The younger generation wishes to distinguish themselves from the older generation, have their own language and their own identity. And so they'll make changes to the language. It comes in contact with other languages, other social contexts. So changing is a natural part of language. We call them living for a reason. I think with language revitalization, sometimes it can be, the ideal is to pick up exactly where it was left off and move forward with that. But there are, again, these different factors that are at play, like speakers who are their native language is a different language, and they're learning a language as a second language. That's going to inherently affect the way that language functions. So changing the language and it not being identical to what was spoken by the elders is okay. You're definitely want to pay attention to it and try to mitigate a lot of those changes as much as possible, but there's going to be some changes. It is unavoidable and a natural part of language use and life. And also, the more endangered language is, the more difficult it is to revitalize. It's not impossible. It's never impossible. We'll see some examples later of that. But it is definitely something to consider how far along in the endangerment process you are, how many speakers are available to you, what's the documentation situation of that language, and consider those factors moving forward. The more endangered it is, you have some obstacles, but everything can always be overcome with enough determination. I think this is as much as I've spoken in like 2 weeks because I've been quarantined here in Hawaii for a while. All right, so let's talk about goals of revitalization. Now, these are just very, very broad goals. Revitalization is one of those topics that we think of it and conceptualize it as a very broad topic, but it's going to change and really be affected by each community and the circumstances that that community is in and the people involved in the revitalization process. So just very general goals here, what we're going to discuss, but make sure to think about what's important to your community, what are the individual goals you want to set up for your community, and factor those in when setting your own goals. So general goals are obviously to increase the number of speakers. To reverse language shift, we want to move speakers in an upward direction, so have more speakers or growth of speakers. We also want to increase language use within and between different sections of the population. So we want to make sure to reestablish that intergenerational transmission. And what we mean by that is the speaking and passing on the language from one generation to the next. So you want to make sure that you're focusing on different age groups in different domains. How do we actually get to use this language? Such as like going to the grocery store and being able to purchase groceries and use the language at checkout, or at ceremonies or any sort of gatherings that you may have. Activities like going outside, and can you have a whole conversation just in normal daily interaction with someone you run into on the street. So increasing the language use and the domains in which that language is used are going to be some of the more broad goals. And let's talk about some of the challenges that are going to come along with it, because language revitalization is definitely a challenging endeavor. And some of these are the more common ones. Again, they're going to vary and be more unique to each community, but these are some that we kind of see throughout multiple communities who have embarked on language revitalization projects of their own. So obviously speakers is going to be an issue. How many speakers are left of a language, especially if the language is under-documented. You'll want to make sure to know how many speakers there are and be able to document that language as thoroughly as possible before those speakers leave us. And also, revitalization movements tend to rely very heavily on native speakers for their knowledge, for helping establish the programs. It's definitely something that is challenging. The less speakers you have, the more difficult this is going to be. But it is the goal to, again, increase the number of speakers. So hopefully it won't be a challenge for too long. Another thing is government policies and socioeconomic factors. These can be very difficult concepts to combat. Obviously, government policies are something that can vary from where a language can be used. So can a language be used as a means of education? Can it be used in the school system? Is it optional for legal recourses? Can you get documentation from the government in those languages? And sometimes there are just direct and overt oppression of a language, completely outlawing the use of a language by policy. There's also social stigmatization that can happen, which is more of a social action, where the language is not technically illegal or outlawed, but it is highly stigmatized and can be used to shame people into not speaking their language. Economic factors can be things like parents wanting their children to have the best opportunities and seeing a negative connection between their indigenous language and the opportunities for their children if they don't speak a global language more fluently. So they may choose not to pass the language on to their children. These are all very complex and complicated reasons for language endangerment, and I definitely advise to get to know those situations, but be cautious in understanding of the histories and the effects that these have and have had and continue to have on communities. Also, we have domains of use. We touched briefly on that on the last slide. Places where the language can be used. If it's only used in the home or only in a school setting, that's a very limited domain of use. And so you want to reestablish those domains of use outside of those areas where language is actually being reclaimed and broaden that ability to use the language. It's an essential part of language revitalization, but also one of the most difficult, because if you're going to use language at the store, the teller has to be able to use the language, and the person checking out has to be able to use language to be able to complete that transaction. So you have to hit sort of a critical mass in language revitalization to be able to really expand those domains of use, but it is something you should always have in mind when setting goals for your revitalization movement. Interest and involvement can be an interesting topic as well. Interest in the language can vary depending on the prestige associated with the language or the lack thereof. And involvement can be difficult as well. People may be interested in maintaining their language or revitalizing their language, but they have families to support and they have, bills and obligations and things they have to do to maintain life. And so they may not be able to commit much time to language revitalization, and it is a very work-intensive topic and undertaking to take on. So there may be a lack of interest or a lack of involvement or both. It's just something you're going to have to evaluate in your community and something you want to keep in mind when setting, again, those goals for your project of how can you increase interest and increase involvement and make opportunities for people to really participate in the revitalization movement while maintaining their other obligations. Pedagogical materials and funding go pretty much hand in hand. If you look at pedagogical materials for English, Spanish, Chinese, any of these global languages, if you Google it, you can find infinite amount of resources for online learning, for apps, physical materials, curriculum. There's a plethora of materials for these languages, but that's not the case if you Google it for maybe your own language. And so a shortage of materials puts the burden on teachers who are already working very hard to try and establish these programs, teach students, maintain a school setting or a community gathering, and then they have to meet these materials on top of that. Funding for materials is also difficult to find. It is becoming, I think, better to get funding for materials, but documentation funding is a lot easier to obtain than funding for curriculum design, for example. So funding is always something you have to pay for a space. If you're going to have a school or a gathering of some sort, you need to pay your staff, your faculty. Again, this involvement, this time factor, you need to pay people for their time and make sure they're able to take care of themselves, and that all takes money. So funding is definitely a big challenge for many communities when it comes to language revitalization. And perhaps the biggest challenge of all is time. And I think it's the one challenge on this list that we really have no control over. Time is a factor. If we're losing speakers in the community, then you only have so much time before they leave us. And you have to manage so many other activities and balance so many balls while trying to move a project forward. And time can feel like a huge challenge, that there's never enough of it. But it's just something you have to keep in mind and try and plan accordingly, but it is definitely challenging. All right, so now that we've kind of covered what language revitalization is, some of the goals and challenges of language revitalization, we're going to talk about how we go about revitalizing a language. Now, there's many different ways. We're going to cover some of the most popular methods or well-known methods of language revitalization, and then we'll discuss like the pedagogical material design that a lot of those communities have undertaken. So levels of magnitude, we can divide these into two different categories, large and small. Large are going to be your country-wide or community-wide revitalization efforts. And so things like Hebrew in Israel, that was a country-wide revitalization movement, and it was funded by the government, and everybody spoke Hebrew and learned Hebrew. Same thing with Scottish and Irish Gaelic. I'm still not sure how to pronounce that correctly. But that's, again, a very large-scale movement. And same thing with Olelo Hawaii. The Kingdom of Hawaii decided to move towards language revitalization. And so it was a very unified island-wide or archipelago-wide movement to revitalize. But you also have small-scale revitalization efforts. And these are going to be your more individual or small groups within a community that really are focused on language revitalization. And that can be something as small as family use in the home, or it can be something like setting up an immersion school or having classes at some sort of community gathering spot. So we have both large and small. Sometimes small leads into larger revitalization movements that can grow and become more widespread. So we'll start talking with language nests, which are a very, I think, iconic view on how to approach language revitalization. And they are a preschool or a kindergarten setting. And it's where child care providers are usually native speakers or advanced second language speakers, and they speak to the children in the native language while providing child care. And there are a couple examples, Te Hongareo in Aotearoa, which is New Zealand, the Maori program, and Ahapuna Leo here in Hawaii are some very well-known examples. The Te Hongareo is a language nest that was established, the first language nest, and it was established in April 1982. Currently now there are 460 of them throughout Aotearoa, and they have 9,000 children roughly enrolled in these programs, which represents 5% of all the children in early childhood education. So that's fantastic numbers. It started with just one nest and grew from there. And it was definitely a community-based project. And so that grew and then inspired Aha Punana Leo here in Hawaii. And that was set up 2 years later in 1984 on the island of Kauai. And now there are 11 preschools located throughout the 5 larger Hawaiian islands. And it's grown, it's a great program. And it was opened, like I said, in 1984. For those of you who don't know, in Hawaii, it was actually outlawed. Hawaiian was not to be used as the medium of education specifically for almost 100 years, 90 years. It was not allowed. So Punana Leo started before that. The Kapuna decided they wanted to use this as a way to do instruction and childcare, and began that before that law was lifted in 1986. So next we have immersion schools. And immersion schools are anywhere from post-kindergarten all the way up through the end of high school. So this follows very much a Western academic model as far as educational model, and it can vary between some or all of the academic subjects being taught in the indigenous language. There's a lot of variety in how immersion schools are approached. And so an example here from Hawaii again is Ke Kula Kaiapuni o Anuenue, or just Anuenue for short. It's a K through 12 Hawaiian immersion school on this island, Oahu, where I'm at, located in the back of Palolo Valley. And they start off full immersion, and it's completely in Hawaiian. And then as the children get older and further into the program, they start introducing English and different subjects later on. So it's not immersion the whole way through, but immersion to the first part and then a mixed model after that. It focuses both on traditional cultural practices as well as academic subjects. So it's a fusion of education from the Department of Education academic standards and Hawaiian cultural education as well. Right. So master apprentice programs are another great option. These programs can be focused more on adult learners. The previous 2 language nests and immersion schools focus on children, and this focuses on the adult age group. Excuse me. And it's one that I think is not as well discussed as children. The focus tends to heavily be on children, which is rightfully so. They're going to carry us into the future, and they're great language learners. But adults are important too. Educating adults and getting adult language speakers helps you with that intermediate generation that's going to carry on teaching the children. So a master apprentice program is a great way to educate some adults in the language. And this functions with the apprentice, who's a heritage speaker who works with a master person who is a native speaker. And this can be either meeting regularly just to converse in language, or in the more intensive ones, they can actually move in with the elder and learn the language through complete immersion. So we'll look at the Chickasaw Language Revitalization Program for this. It was founded in 2007 based on smaller community initiatives that had already taken hold. And the goal was approximately 20 individuals were to be selected, and that would produce 10 new fluent speakers in an 18 to 24 month time frame. So it's a very quick turnaround for a fluent speaker. So it's a very intensive program, but it's a great way to kind of jumpstart adult language acquisition with revitalization. Okay, so other community-based initiatives, we have individuals within the community who can be learning their language. This can be at any age, young to old, and they just study the language on their own and maybe speak it just with themselves and the elders they know, or they bring it to their family or friend groups. It can be very small. Then we also have activities like summer camps, weekend activities. Those are great places to start. They're very controllable, very small, great stepping stone. You can really focus on place-based pedagogy, so focusing on the land, especially in times like summer where you're able to go outside and really explore nature and use the culture lessons from the elders and work those activities together. Another important type of initiative that isn't directly language learning or teaching, but is very important, is language activism. So sometimes communities aren't even aware of the status of their language, or entities like governments or ruling bodies aren't aware of the status of the language. So anything that you go out and raise awareness of the endangerment and promote language activism and language learning, those are great activities and an essential part of language revitalization as well. So we'll look at a couple of things here. We have Jejuo, which is spoken on an island in Korea. And this is a video. You guys can watch these videos. The slides will be uploaded for you later. So I'm not going to play any of them during the presentation, but feel free to go back and watch them. This interview was with Dr. O'Grady. He's a professor here at the University of Hawaii Manoa, and he works with Jejuo in language revitalization. And it was actually believed that Jejuo was a dialect of Korean, and so it was kind of a country dialect of sorts, but it's actually its own language. So there's a lot of language activism going on right now to get it recognized as a separate language from Korean, so that language revitalization efforts can really begin and take place, because it's recognized not as a dialect, but its own entity that needs to be documented and revitalized. This is a great interview. And then another great example is Miamia. Miamia was a dormant language, so there was no native speakers at the time when Darrell Baldwin, he began to learn the language through historic documents at the Smithsonian National Anthropological Archives. And it was a very small community movement. And Darrell reintroduced the language into his home environment. And so he started speaking the language with his children, and it grew from there and gained momentum. He actually won the MacArthur Genius Grant. And so there's a lot of momentum behind that movement now. They're doing a teacher training program. They have summer camps and activities. So that's a great example of a very small individual sort of effort that kind of grew and grew into something much larger. Oh, that's for the live one. This is a great thing to think about, though, is what could you do in your community to help support your language? So really think about the community that you're in, what factors have led to endangerment, and how you can go about combating some of those, doing some activism, planning goals for revitalization, and really kind of making in a plan of how to proceed in revitalization efforts. Okay, so here's some tips for successful revitalization efforts. Long-term community commitment and enthusiasm is necessary for revitalization. It is a very long process, and so maintaining that and rallying up that enthusiasm is going to be an essential part of getting momentum and keeping that momentum up as you make this journey into language revitalization. A well-thought-out plan and step-by-step achievable goals. Again, this is a very long-term project, and those can get really hard to manage. It can feel like you're not making progress, or you're not making progress fast enough. So having a plan and breaking it down to very small achievable goals is a great way to approach something like language revitalization and reevaluate that plan as you get to know the desires and needs of the community more. The children will bring up things that actions they want to take or directions they want to go in that may help you refine or redirect your revitalization efforts. So always have a plan and revisit it and revise it often. Speakers and adult learners will act as mentors and teachers. So making sure to have, again, that middle group that's between the native speakers and the children, getting them involved and having them take on more mentorship roles and teaching roles is going to be a great way to make sure there's continuity between the beginning of a revitalization movement and it's expanding and growing into the future. Language immersion, it tends to be a very popular way to approach language revitalization. It's not the only way, but it is one that is kind of the gold standard. The more time you can spend with the speaker, the more input you get in the language, the better you're going to be able to understand that language, and the more opportunities you have to speak the language, obviously you'll get better at production as well. Commitment to language use in most domains, not just at the school and in home. So these are great places to start. School and home tend to be jumping off points and absolutely need to be a part of revitalization movements. But it is not where you want to keep the language contained. At home, it's something that's more small and small scale. You want to make the language more accessible to a broader community. And if you only have it in school and never bring it outside of that setting, then you run the risk of turning the language into an academic subject that's studyable versus a living language that's used for communication and actually is living fully within the community. Commitment to language use the most, I just said that. Create materials in your language. That's the next step in what we'll be talking about for the rest of the presentation. I think we're still on time. So you want to create materials in your language. That's going to be a great way to involve people in language revitalization, to build your kind of, canon of literature and materials that you can use to teach, and is a fun way to engage in language revitalization and an essential one. So what we'll talk about now is materials. And this topic is way too broad to cover here in a 1-hour presentation. But what we'll do is talk about some concepts of how to approach material development, what types of materials you can make. And then we'll look at some examples that have been made by various communities. These are ones that I'm familiar with, so there are plenty of others, and I encourage all of you who are watching to include links and ideas for anything that your community has come up with in the comments. But we'll talk about the community that I'm involved with, which is mostly here in Hawaii and over on Turtle Island or native North America. So where to begin? There are two different sort of halves to this. When we're talking about material development for language revitalization purposes, right? You have the linguistic aspects and the culture aspects, because you want to have both. Now, linguistic aspects are ones that we've been talking about throughout this workshop. So you have things like phonology, morphology, syntax. And these are linguistic features that you want to focus on when you're creating teaching materials for revitalization context. You want to target specific linguistic features of a language that may be unique or iconic for your language or language family. Things that maybe are challenging for learners. If you already have an immersion program set up and you notice that students are really struggling with this particular voice alternation, then you can create materials around that specific linguistic feature that is going to help them practice and acquire that feature. You can also look at gaps that exist in materials. If you are lucky enough to have a community that has some materials already in existence, look for where there are linguistic aspects of language that aren't discussed in those materials and create materials to fill those gaps. So examples for phonology is, again, stress, intonation, maybe making an activity that focuses on sound production, something that's not in their first language that students have a hard time producing. You can look at morphological template if your language is very polysynthetic and has a lot of morphology, maybe creating material around that. Word order, voice alternations, really any aspect of a language can be the focus of a teaching material. But equally as important, you want to make sure to include culture in your pedagogical material design. No one likes grammar lessons besides linguists. It's not engaging, it's not something that you really want to have just a traditional, here's a paradigm, here is a set of rules for the language, but really embed that in the culture, because that is what the language is communicating, right? The purpose of the language. So choose either a specific aspect of the culture to incorporate into this lesson that you're creating, or you can take something that already exists, like a story. Stories are an excellent place to start, and look at what linguistic features are already in that story and use that to help teach particular features. So like stories, you can look and see what voice do you use, passive or active voice more often in stories. Are there particular narrative structures that are really common in your language that you want to focus on? Or you can take a story and manipulate the linguistics of the language in it to focus more on a particular linguistic aspect as well. So keeping both of those halves in mind, the linguistic and the cultural focus, you then want to think about what type of materials you wanted to make. So there are digital, physical, and then there's other materials like activities, classroom interactions, those sorts of things. Digital materials are things like stories. You can make animations, video skits, and tutorials. Informational videos are great as well. Memes, music videos, and video games. These are all very popular approaches to language revitalization, especially geared towards that younger generation. They're very into things that are online and digital, and they're very creative with this as well. If you make this a class activity, children will surprise you how great they are with technology, and they'll just take it and run. Physical activities are also very important and kind of a staple as well. Depending on your community, you may not have access to digital means of creating materials. So physical activity or physical materials would be things like stories, storybooks, graphic novels, comic strips, however you want to refer to those, worksheets, coloring books, illustrated flashcards, picture searches, card or board games, and history games. So these are all things that you can make physical copies of and then use in a classroom setting or at a community game night or something like that. Activities and other sorts of materials are things like plays. That's very popular here in Hawaii. We have Hawaiian language plays, and they're very well attended. So that's a great way to get communities members involved and have this big production, and then you have a gathering that people can come and interact in the language and enjoy a traditional story being told through theater. Poetry is also an excellent way to look at language revitalization. It's great for more advanced speakers as well, because knowing a language well enough to where you can bend or break the rules is definitely a challenge and is a sign of higher language acquisition. Lesson plans for outdoor or traditional activities. So this is great for taking students outside. Maybe you can take them for a nature walk, identifying traditional plants used for medicinal purposes or ceremonial purposes. Working in a lo'i is a very popular aspect here, so a taro root field. Having the students come and learn how to farm taro and use the olelo Hawaii for that activity. And then wordplay is always a fun thing. Tongue twisters, riddles, rhymes, wise sayings, puns, idioms. These are all great ways to play with language, or even just collect them and put them in one place for future generations to look back on. Like idioms tend to have some very interesting linguistic features, and you can document those, break out those features, and then also talk about why you have that idiom. What does it mean? What are the cultural references within it? So those are just some ideas. So we'll look at specific examples. So these are some memes made by Susan Gare for the Karuk language community, and it's part of the Mother Language Meme Challenge. This is a really fun kind of approach to language revitalization, and these are just little bite-sized memes. They're just memes, right? Little mini lessons, and you can either just have the meme itself, like the Star Wars reference here is just the meme. You don't need to explain it. People know what it means, even if they don't know the language, right? And then you can have a caption that tells you what the language means, or sometimes even have more detailed morphological breakdown, as we see with this Princess Bride one in the bottom, and that breaks down what the language means, all the different morphemes, and the translation. So this is a fun little project, and I'm sure teenagers would love to do something like this. It's definitely youth culture memes. This is another great example of a music video. So this is a 5th grader from the Colville Confederated Tribes. Kale, he wrote this song. He translated this song. It's the Seven Nation Army from the White Stripes. And he played this song, and the 1491s, which is an indigenous comedy group, saw it and loved it so much they made a music video starring him. So this is a really fun activity as well. Again, there's links to all these videos and materials that I'm talking about, so you'll be able to access those after the presentation's over. But I definitely recommend watching this. It's amazing. It's a really great video. Okay, so another example is a kind of a word of the day or word of the week. This is the Pagan Institute, who runs the Cutsweat Immersion School in Blackfeet Nation. They have a Facebook page, and they make these little videos that have a Blackfeet word of the day, and it's accompanied by Indian Sign Language. So it has both the sign language and the oral language in a video, and then they post that on their social media, so you can go through and just watch these videos and hear the word of the day or word of the week. So this is a great little, again, very small, easy sort of material to create, but it starts to build that canon for you to have and refer back to as you approach language revitalization. Here's a great example of poetry. So this is Dr. Ophelia Cepeda. She writes poetry in her language, Tohono O'odham, and it is beautiful, beautiful poetry. This video is got great cinematography as well, so it's a beautiful approach to language revitalization, and it's a great example of that, so I definitely recommend reading that. And I know she's part of the NAWA program, who I think is tuned in, so I've got a couple examples from the NAWA program, actually. This is an example of animation. So this is a project I was personally involved in. Here in Hawaii, we chose Mo'olelo Oiwi, which is a traditional story, and we animated it for students to use. And we were working with a particular immersion school over in Kaneohe, which is a different part of the island from where I'm at. But we were going to work with the immersion school there. So we chose He'eme'eole, which is this story here, and it takes place in that bay. And so we chose that because it tied the students who were at that school directly to a story that was on their land, their particular part of the island. So we really focused in on something that was identifiable to the kids and interesting to the kids, and made sure the scenery was appropriate and they'd recognize it instantly as where they were at. And we chose the story because there was a lot of passive voice used within it. And so we wanted to make it into a teaching tool for how you can learn the story and hear examples of the language and passive voice. But then we also created a second version that was used as a form of assessment. So there was a little character in the corner that would pop up and say, hey, did the story say this? And the students had comprehension checks to see if they were understanding the passive constructions. So if you're able to do an animation, you can also turn those in not only to teaching tools, but assessment tools as well. Right. This is another example from the NAMA program, a recent graduate, Kayleen Bigknife. She made these worksheets that work with the Chippewa Cree syllabary and are aimed at increasing literacy in the syllabary for, I believe, grade school kids. So this is a great activity to take on. They're beautifully done, and it's a good activity. Everybody needs that work for the classroom, especially if you're a teacher. If you've ever taught, you know that you just sometimes need to be able to give a worksheet so you can get something else done for the class, or for people to practice at home who don't have access to a program or who aren't able to attend a school. So these are great approaches as well. We're doing it on time. Okay. So a few last ones here is other physical materials. We have Keao Nani, which is a picture book. I love this book. It's really well done. There's a big picture in the middle with items around the outside and the words for those items on the outside. And the inside, they're in that picture. So you can actually use it as a picture dictionary, but also as like kind of a search activity. So it doubles as both. Double purpose materials are going to be your best friend when creating revitalization materials. The more bang for your buck you can get, the better. Graphic novels, there's a great one here. This is Sacred Circle, and it's a story where characters, some of the characters speak in Ojibwe off and on throughout the graphic novel. So it's a great example from Birch Bark Books over in Minnesota. And then finally, posters are a great thing to make as well, and they're easy to design. You have posters that can just hang in the classroom, or you can make double-sided posters like the ones we've made for Pagan Institute with Native Teaching Aids. Is we put the Blackfeet on one side, so that's the side that the teacher would hold towards the students, but on the back side is all the teacher activities and some like key phrases and ideas for what to do with the students. So you can make it a teaching material or a poster. Again, that double duty aspect. Okay, so finally we have brainstorming. So just a couple of ideas to leave you with, and hopefully you've gotten some inspiration from what communities have already done as far as making teaching materials and how you can embark on that journey for your own communities. Make sure to center your domains on everyday life. So things like in the kitchen, working in the low-E, ordering food, those are all great places to start, and something that is immediately useful to learners, something they can use every single day. So definitely starting with something more common and more useful, and then branching out to those more less common, less frequent sorts of domains of use. Again, pick your favorite story or song and outline how to make it into a teaching material. So that's a great place to start, looking at what features linguistically are contained within those and how you could use that in a revitalization context. Those are excellent places to start if you don't know where to begin with teaching materials, because they're kind of already prepackaged for you. Is there a language feature that you feel iconic, unique, or challenging for learners? Just identifying what the needs are of your students, evaluating where they're at and what they're struggling with as second language learners in this context is a great way for you to know and kind of focus your energies into the materials that are going to be most useful in the current students' lives, and then developing outwards from there. And then finally, think about formats. Do you want something that's going to be more independent study, so something people can do on their own at home, or do you want to be more of a communication focus, so you need multiple people to interact with each other to be able to complete the task or the activity? And do you want it to be more competitive or collaborative in nature? People vary as far as if they like to be more collaborative or if they like to be more competitive. Games are a great way to create both of those contexts and have a competitive game and have a collaborative one. So that you can have different kind of contexts and different language arises in those situations. With competitive games, you can get something like taunting. You can bring that up as a lesson of teasing and taunting each other, and how would you do that in a competitive situation. Collaborative, you could have something like a lot of helping language. Do you need help? How do I do this? And have those sorts of framing questions and vocabulary that comes up with asking for help and offering help. Right, so thanks everyone for coming to today's webinar. I'm going to stick around for a while and look at the comments and try to interact with you as much as possible. So we'll be here, and thank you so much for watching. Hi, Yam. Hi, Kayleen. You guys are in the chat. You're welcome. Thank you for tuning in. Hopefully we gave you some good information. And if you have any materials you create or questions, feel free to continue to post in the Facebook group, because we can get some great conversation started on creating teaching materials and how that's approached. That was awesome. I hope everybody is staying safe and sane during this time. I know it's been challenging, but it's been nice to see everybody kind of rally on a global level. So I hope you're all doing well. We've been kind of moved our whole lives online at this point, so I'm looking forward to when quarantine ends and we can interact in person. But this webinar is already set up for this situation, so it was perfect. We didn't have to adjust or cancel it at all. Oh my god, it's disappeared. Where'd they go? All right. Think. Well, there's no questions now. Feel free again to post in the Facebook group. You can go ahead and post there, and we can brainstorm together. If you have any questions about creating materials or revitalization efforts for your community, I'm sure we'll be happy to give you input and feedback and really work together in that comment section. So go ahead and post comments there as you need. Until then, I hope everyone stays safe, and I will speak to you in the Facebook group. Aloha.